All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Sorry if my voice is not going to be able to carry today, so hopefully you can hear me here. Well, good afternoon and welcome to our second College of Liberal Arts Faculty Colloquium of the Spring 24 semester. Thank you all for attending today's presentation. My name is Adam Sizemore, and I will be the moderator for today's talk and each of the remaining talks in the 2024 academic year. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few comments before we hand it over to Jane. We are recording this session, which will be uploaded on YouTube on Monday. If you have any questions for the speaker, let's save them for the end where we'll have a Q&A. And then if any students are in the audience who wish to receive credit or bonus for this, we do have some sign-up sheets, faculty specific, but if they're not up there, you can let me know and I will reach out to them. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Jane Weatherand is an assistant professor of public relations and advertising in the Department of Media and Communication at USI. She has a bachelor's in political science from Hollins University, a master's degree in journalism and mass communications from the University of Southern Carolina, and a PhD in mass communications from the University of Southern Carolina. Her research focuses on health communication, more specifically child sexual abuse, sexual assault, and media effects. Her recent scholarship can be found published in the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse, the Journal of Applied Communication Research, and the Journal of Experimental Criminology. The research she will present today was funded by the Office of the Vice President for Research, called the Support to Promote Advancement of Research and Creativity, or SPARC grant, at the University of South Carolina. This graduate research grant is a merit-based award designated to ignite research and creative excellence across all disciplines at USC. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks so much for turning out to hear my talk. I'm here to present skill development research that I worked on. It's actually two scales, or two measurements. And these measurements are statements that will measure people's beliefs and attitudes about child sexual abuse. Some statements that I developed regard blame for this issue, and some statements are more statements that illustrate stereotypes you might have about child sexual abuse and your attitudes and beliefs. An interesting thing about me is I am a professor of public relations and advertising. It's a bit unusual for us to do skill development. We will sometimes on public relations topics and things of this nature. And so there's a bit of an opening story about how I got started or involved in this specific type of research. So, to begin with, what happened, as usually happens with us, we might find a set of statements or a scale already in the literature that we might be able to use in our own research. Say a scale that might measure someone's level of self-esteem or otherwise, right? And it's great because as long as we cite that person, that is an existing, reliable, and valid measurement of someone's level of self-esteem or any other belief or attitude. I found an actual child sexual abuse myth scale in the research already out there that was developed by Dr. Stephen Collins in South Africa. And I'm not sure if anybody knows this about skill development research, but it has to be tested in certain cultures before it's reliable and viable to be used in that culture. So he had tested it in South Korea and also in South Africa and then Norway, but not in the United States. So when I entered a PhD program at the University of South Carolina, I contacted him in South Africa and I said, Dr. Collins, I want to explore your scale in the United States so I might be able to use it in my dissertation research later. So I proceeded to do this with the help of a professor. I recruited 400 plus undergraduates in 100 level classes at the University of South Carolina and gave them these scale items between the whole year, between fall 2015 and spring 2016. And so I accomplished that, but unfortunately it did not have significant results, and I did present this to the Crimes Against Children Research Center in New Hampshire in 2016. Well, I presented this at this conference, but it did not go through. It didn't test out significantly statistically. The experts there stood up in the room and said, you really must start over and produce a new measurement. So we may have a belief in rateness scale, but there are no scales that measure this other than Collins scale previously. But let me just show you some of the items that were on Dr. Collins' scale, and it might become clear as to why they didn't test out significantly just on the face of them. So I just wanted to highlight all these because I know there's a lot of information on one slide. There are really two. But for example, to highlight the top one, sexual contact between an adult and a child which is wanted by the child, which is physically pleasurable for the child, cannot really be described as being abusive. Well, many of you in this room right away would say, well, I completely disagree with that, yes, right? And that's what ended up happening when I gave it to all these 400 plus undergraduate students. They were confronted with these items to answer strongly agree to strongly disagree, and many of them strongly disagreed. Here's another example of one that was not so good. A woman who does not satisfy her partner sexually must bear some of the responsibility if her partner feels frustrated and turns to her children for sexual satisfaction. I mean, I understand your mouths are open. Yes, my mouth was a little open as well. And the students said, no, yes, we strongly disagree with that. And I have just two, whoops, go back. I have just two more that I thought were sort of illustrative of why this particular set of measurements already did not do well. This one of them is adolescent girls who wear very revealing clothing are asking to be sexually abused. And boys are more likely than girls to enjoy sexual contact with an adult and are therefore less likely to be emotionally traumatized by the experience. Right there, many people, luckily we were so educated about just sexual assault in general, that many of us would strongly disagree with some of these statements. And that's why this first scale that I found of Dr. Collins did not perform very well. And so I was asked to start over. So I'll just kind of try to review how that went. So here's how I started over. And I first want to say that when I first read Dr. Collins' scale was 11 years ago. Then when I went to start over, that was 8 years ago. And then there was 5 years since me actually conducting the research, and then finally here at USI being given a LAR grant to be able to type it up for publication. So it has been a long journey, 11-year journey on this, what they asked me to do. So I had to apply for a grant because my first answer to the experts was, I don't have any money and I'm just a student. I had no money to do this research and it was going to cost money. And I did win this fabulous grant from the University of South Carolina, and it was, I was chosen among all of the different kinds of fields in the entire university, and only about 150 people were chosen to receive this. So it was a pretty competitive grant. I developed on my own a minimum of 40 items for each new scale from previous literature that I found. And because I don't work in the ivory tower, I went to my local rape crisis center, my child advocacy center, and without telling them the items I had developed, I asked them to come up with 40 more. And it was very easy for them to do because many of them hear from parents saying things like, that woman never should have married him, or she knew about it, or they were hearing these kind of statements from people, you know, in their field. So they each gave me another 40, right? And then, it doesn't want to work. There we go. After cross-checking for similar statements and rewording, I eliminated those, because some were similar to each other, yes? And if you want to see all the ones I started out with, just in case anyone's curious, I did for show and tell purposes tape them all up there, over there on the board. So I came up with in the end, and you'll see those on the left, 49 items that I started with for the blame for a child sexual abuse scale. And then I came up with 77, which are on the right there, for the belief and stereotype scale. Now, why on earth would you say would I have to develop 2 scales for the price of 1? Well, it has to do with how we measure constructs. And what that means is, well, at the outset, one thing I learned was a statement like that mother was not paying attention and that's why that happened is kind of a statement of blame, is it not? But a statement that's like, doesn't this normally happen to children of divorce? Isn't that more like a belief in a stereotype that is a true statement? Yeah. And because those might crisscross when I went to measure it in people, I thought, well, clearly, I think I'm going to have to separate these 2 things out. Yes? And that's why we have 2 scales that I developed for the $5,000. The scale development involves doing sort of like 5 studies in one, so just bear with me here. But the first thing I had to do after coming up with the items for each one over there is you're supposed to send this to child sexual abuse experts all over the country and the world to give you feedback on them, yes? And to get their input. This part of the work took a full year. It's just very hard to get busy professors and experts to take the time, to help you, but eventually they did. But that took one of the longest periods of time. They provided some editing and comments on the items, and if you do want to go up and see, the experts are listed there, and the scores that they gave it are there on those charts. So based on what they said, I asked them to give each scale statement a score of 1 from 4 to 10, which would be excellent in measuring the construct. Then what I did with it is anything that had a mean score that is in yellow over there on the right of less than 5, I cut immediately from the list of items. So their feedback helped me reduce some of these items. These are my experts. I'm very proud that they helped me. They represent a lot of top child sexual abuse experts in the country and actually in the world. Carrie-Ann Walsh, it was in Australia, and at the time, Dr. Georgia Gavatsikas was also in Australia. So then the next step that you have to complete for developing scales is you run focus groups. You want to get people's feedback on what they think more qualitatively about these items and what they think about them. So I held a student focus group with 16 students, males and females, evenly divided, and I gave them pen and paper, strongly agree to strongly disagree with these statements, and then we discussed it for 3 hours, yes, and I provided incentives to them. So not only did they answer it, they told me things like, and here's an example of something that happened. The statement, boys cannot be sexually abused, was presented to them, for example. Well, everyone strongly disagreed with that in both focus groups. So that helped me eliminate that statement, for example, because it showed no variance. If nobody believes it to be true, you don't have enough people that strongly agree to strongly disagree for it to measure anything accurately. So that's just an example of how I ended up dropping it. And this is just how I did it. I'm telling you my steps, but I'm briefly going over it. Then I ran it with parents. I had 4 men and 8 women come to that. And I recruited them on parent Facebook pages. Did the same thing with them, and they helped me eliminate some of the items as well. So then I ended up with a final scale to test of 19 items for the Blaine scale and 26 for the stereotype scale. So then the next step is you have to send it out to a survey. So if I had $5,000, at this point I had burned through about $500 or $600 in incentives for the focus groups, correct? The experts, I didn't have to spend any of my grant funding. This part, I recruited a panel from Qualtrics, representative of the national population, and I spent the rest of my $5,000 because for it to be statistically significant, I wanted to gain as many participants as I could. So, this just goes over it as 826 respondents recruited by Qualtrics, and I did tell them, for example, to have it in line with how the population in this country, meaning if you were Asian American, male, female, all of it had to line up to be nationally representative, which is why it also cost me quite a bit of money for those 836 participants. And then they had to be, of course, U.S. citizen, 18 years of age or older. They were asked to respond on a 6-point Likert scale. No choice for agree or disagree. Well, there's a reason that I did that. They were not provided a neutral option. And the reason is when you conduct research on icky topics like this, you really don't want to give them the option to choose a neutral because sometimes they just are not going to like what they're reading and decide to take the easy way out as a respondent and go down that neutral lane. I wanted to force my respondents to really consider these statements and go to one side of the fence or the other, yes? And that is a guideline when you do this type of research that you need to adhere to. And because you had discovered it also in the focus group that a lot of them have given a neutral choice, we're trying to go down that road. So it was finalized that I needed to not do that. The leading scale development scholar right now is Robert DeVellis. He's written several books on scale development that outline these steps, and I strictly adhere to everything he states that you must do in order to develop accurate, reliable, and valid measures. And that's just him backing up why the even numbers should be used. I'm not going to get into this too much. This is just the demographics. I clearly had to provide that in the paper that is under review right now for publication at the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse. But this is the most important thing. First of all, for the blame scale, I had to conduct something called exploratory factor analysis. And for most of you in this room, if you're not quantitative, it just means that I had to take it through a series of statistical gymnastics, is what I might call that, to basically find out the subscales, which things accurately loaded and actually measured people's beliefs in the blame aspects of this. So for example, when I did this, here's an example. Item 6, when sexual abuse occurs within a family, the non-offending parent must have known it was going on. This cross-loaded onto 2 factors, and I'll show you what those factors are. And when that happens, it's not going to accurately write or validly measure that because it's cross-loading onto 2 factors. I'll show you that in the next slide. Factors 1 and 3 at item 11, alcohol abuse causes perpetrators of sexually abused children, did not score a .40 coefficient or above, so that was eliminated. Item 18, children lie about child sexual abuse, and item 19, children lie about sexual abuse to get out of trouble. There were too few items to make up a subscale. Again, this will become clear on the next slide on the table. There needs to be a minimum of 3 items for it to have a subscale measurement, and they were dropped, resulting in a final scale of 15. Then item 17, the child should have told someone that the sexual abuse was happening so it would be stopped. Was retained because the score just hit under .40. Some of these are decisions you make as you're running the statistical results of these tests. So here's a summary of the exploratory on the full sample of 826. It's a little difficult to see, and most of you don't need to understand too much about the numbers. I think the focus should be on these factors. So for example, when I say responsibility, they're saying things like, if a child did not want the sexual abuse to happen, he or she would say no. They're making the child responsible, right? Factor 2, when I first ran it, would have been society. So if you go down to the bold ones, the amount of violence in the media influenced child sexual abuse offenders. That scored high. These are the factors. Parent, did they blame the parent? So statements kind of like these here. A mother saw him looking at her child that way but never did anything to stop it. That clearly measured blame for the parent, right? Then we have the child. Some of these were like children lie about child sexual abuse. Those scored high enough in coefficients to say that they measured out on these 4 factors. But what I'm trying to do here too is maybe also end up reducing the number of factors, and so you take it through some more analyses. This one is when I take the exploratory factor analysis on the stereotypes scale. I had to do this with the same 826 full set of respondents. So I ran this and I came up with factors of, it's going too fast. This one is physical signs, causes, perpetrators, families, and children. A total of 8 items ended up being removed, and these were most children who have been sexually abused because it loaded between 2 factors. Again, a crisscross like that is not good. And then these other items here were trimmed because support was found for a total of 5 factors based on the scree plot. These were dropped at this time. Children often lie about child sexual abuse. Alcohol use is a significant factor for people who commit child sexual abuse, using alcohol. And I probably should stop here. Some of these sound very similar, don't they, right? And you need to understand that that is actually okay in doing this type of research because people might respond or strongly agree or disagree with the statement even on the nuances of the wording. So don't let that trip you up. Some of these will seem very, very similar to each other, but that's important when you first develop the statements, because there are nuances when people are confronted with these. People who commit child sexual abuse are psychologically disturbed. People who commit child sexual abuse are mentally ill, and people who commit, it would seem that that would be straight up, which is clearly why that one was eliminated at this time. So here's the summary of the exploratory for that one. I don't think this is the actual proper slide, but there's some of it on there, the physical signs, perpetrators, families, children, and whatnot. Oh no, here's the rest of it. I'm sorry, it wouldn't fit on one slide. And these are for all the different factors for those statements. Then I had to conduct something called final confirmatory analysis. You split the data set into two to run this, which is what I did. I think this might be a lot of Greek to many of you in the room. You just need to know that confirmatory analysis and the statistical reporting I've done here is showing that it is reliable and valid measure, and that that has been confirmed, is probably the best way to say it for most involved watching this, yes? So the best thing to see regarding this is the actual table. So again, if I split the data set to 413, and there's a statistical convention that says this is the proper way to do this, you end up, these are the final 15 items that made it all the way down the journey that apparently accurately, reliably, and validly would measure your blame for child sexual abuse. So this is the end result in its entirety. So the first factor ended up being only 3 factors here in the end, not the 4 I started out with. The factor 1 would be blame to the child, blame society, or blame the parent. First one, if a child did not want the sexual abuse to happen, he or she would tell someone. So again, that's up on the child. Child sexual abuse can be avoided by the victim. That one scored high. If a child did not want it to happen, he or she would fight back. That scored high. If a child did not want it to happen, he or she would say no, scored high. And children have a responsibility. This one really got me, y'all. Think about this one for a minute. Children have a responsibility to actively resist sexual advances made by adults. So today in elementary schools, we teach our children the bad touch, no touch thing, right? And most of us by now, particularly any students that are here, have been through that training today, yes? But in a way that is based on this idea, right, that at some point you have to actively thwart advances of sexual offenders should something like this happen, yes? However, it seems a little twisted that maybe parents should become more educated about this, and that ended up being another venue of research I ended up going into. You know, how is it that we can get parents more involved in actively assisting with this? The ones that were blamed for society, the amount of violence in the media influences child sexual abuse offenders, that scored high. The amount of sex in the media influences child sexual abuse offenders. The prevalence of child sexual abuse is directly related to our societal values, scored high. Child sexual abuse is a product of a sexually unhealthy society, high. Now, I'll just point out maybe for the parent, some of the most interesting ones that I found just almost stunned me that made it through, the ones that scored for blame of the parent. And one of these was the child's mother never should have married him. Now, I kind of really was stumped on this one, but I actually, even in when going back to my focus groups with parents, there were mothers and fathers who sat there and were convinced that this really was the case, that somehow the woman must have known. You see? I find that fascinating that that one made it all the way through. But even beginning with focus groups and then sending it out for the statistical analysis and the survey, right, to conduct the research, the 826 respondents, this still, enough people had variance of belief or either agreement or disagreement with this. I was fascinated by that one. There's going to be a couple other interesting ones I found that I couldn't believe. So then we move on to do a final confirmatory analysis of the belief in stereotype scales with half of the population. And These are going to sound similar, these first one I'm going to read, but even going back to the focus groups, there was a lot of variance in belief or disbelief about these things. I found that fascinating. There would be proof of child sexual abuse on a physical examination. That still scored pretty high, okay? There'd be physical signs, and these are different, proof versus physical signs. The reason these are so similar is some people might read there'll be proof and think, oh, no, I disagree with that, yes? But if then they read the next one, there would be physical signs, they might go, yeah, there should be some kind of physical sign. So I hope, remember how I said they sometimes will sound very close to each other, but it's important to tease out those nuances when you do these, when you do this type of research. They also believed, at least believed or disbelieved, that most incidents of child sexual abuse involve physical force. That made it through. That perpetrators use physical force to ensure children comply. For causes, they had alcohol use, drug use. This one, which is actually also can technically be, it's included in this, as a stereotype. Most children who have been sexually abused will grow up to be perpetrators of sexual abuse. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that from people, from all types of people, and it's not true at all. It's absolutely not true. And I find it fascinating, of course, it made it through, that enough people either strongly agree or strongly disagree with that for it to have made it through as well. It's still there. Perpetrators, sexually abused children, because they were abused as children, is a very similar statement, again, high. I have had, when I first started out doing this research, I had other PhD students turn to me and say, but Jane, doesn't this normally happen to children of divorce? Well, that's also not true. These next ones have to do with that, like how this occurs in families, right? Child sexual abuse is more likely to occur in unstable families, or in families that are socially isolated, or single-parent homes, and that children make up stories. Here's the one that made it all the way through from Dr. Collins' scale. And I'm still astounded by this, but it did make it through to the end. Sexual contact between an adult and a child can satisfy a child's need for fixed physical affection. That's one that was on that original, I'll just dub it the achy one from Dr. Collins. It made it all the way through. So it still was measuring that in people. So I find that interesting. And really, that's it in a nutshell. If you have any questions, I can try to answer them. And I did all you about Kathy. I had to have the last 4 points, yes.
So how did you see this scale being used?
Oh, excellent question. I'm so glad you asked that. So the thing is, once I publish it, it is under review right now. Anybody can use it. You can give this to anybody, okay? And it should measure both scales, right? You can give them both sets of statements. It should accurately, reliably, and validly measure their belief in stereotypes for it or their attribution of blame for it, like who they blame for this. And that's one thing that drove me in doing the work. It became an accidental rabbit hole situation. I discovered a scale. I thought, well, easy, I'll just use Dr. Collins' scale. It flopped, and then by that time, I learned or knew too much, and I just decided, well, Jane, if not you, then who will? You might as well just go forward with it. And then I was lucky enough to get awarded the money. Now, I guess enough other people thought that it was needed that they agreed to give me the grant. Shri, yes, sir.
So how do you, congratulations.
Thank you.
For developing this scale. How do you plan to use this in your own research? I mean, this is your research, but how do you plan to use to answer research questions?
Yes, now that I ended up developing a scale that I wanted to have in time to even use for my dissertation, which did not happen, so you're exactly right, Shri, I kind of ended up not being able to use it. I can't wait to collaborate with other researchers in all areas, criminology, people like Taylor Petty, who's been doing some trafficking research. You know, it might be valuable to measure people's beliefs about this type of thing because it's related, right? Yeah, for sure. Going forward, to have done it now, I can use it in mine, but more importantly, I feel this is the best work I've ever done. And the reason is, it's not just for my dissertation, it's not just for my field, it is for the world. It is for people in the field every day to use. When parents come in about foster care, they can give this to people and be able to tell them, oh boy, they still hold these beliefs, right? Or if they don't, right? It's for any field, sociology, psychology, criminology, any nursing, any field that wants to give this to people to gain a measurement about people's attitudes and beliefs about this. Very similar to the rate-miss scale that was originally developed by Martha Burt in 1980 and then expanded upon by Alonzo and Fitzgerald in the 90s. We had an attempt from Collings, and I do praise him for that attempt back in 1997 for trying this. Most of his items he got from the Jackson incest blame scale, which is maybe why today I'm grateful that when I went to do it, I discovered at this outset that many of us had been educated about these problematic statements and beliefs regarding sexual assault in general. Therefore, that's why some of his statements weren't panning out, is the best way to describe it, and why it probably needed to be redone. And then I didn't mean to develop 2 scales for the price of one, but I do remember one of the experts saying that they thought that was super, that for $5,000 they got a lot out of me, so that was fun. But there are reasons why I did that. I thought we'd get a laugh since it is such a serious topic. Anybody else got something? I'm so sorry about the technological stuff, Sri.
Yeah, take it back to Africa and see if this works good.
Oh, to South Africa. You know, I hadn't thought about that, Sri. And you know what's very sad, to be honest? I keep reaching out to him and he's not answering. And I know he was getting older. And every time I want to call South Africa, unfortunately, I have to be up till 3 a.m. to kind of reach out to him and call and see if he's okay. I've periodically kept in touch with him over the years, but it's now been a couple years, even despite my emails, that he hasn't responded. So I'm a little concerned. I don't know if he's retired and like an emeritus now, and maybe he's not checking, you know. That's part of it. But again, anytime I finally feel like I can make time to call, I would have to be up till 3 a.m. to call and follow up. But yeah, I tried to share this way. He was excited for me. I will say this, in the academia where sometimes people will be at war or maybe confrontational about this, he was not at all. He was very supportive. Even when I wrote him and said I need to start over, he said, well, good, Jane. And we've been talking. We've always talked we'd want to meet someday. And I think I also experienced that with a lady up here that I showed you earlier. Her name was Dr. Alyssa Reingold. And many years ago when I was a master's student starting down this topic area in general, I called her up on the telephone, and she worked at Medical University of South Carolina and had published some things on this. And I just sort of talked her head off for about a half an hour or so. And then finally I said to her, I'm so sorry I'm taking up your time, but I said, I doubt many people are jumping up and down and I'm trying to crawl up your tree about this topic. And she said, you have a point, Jane. I don't mind helping. And then years later, she helped me with the scale. So the wonderful professors and people that are out there that will help you will help you. Were there some that told me, no, I don't have time? Yes. And then a real funny story, just so I can get a laugh from you over this serious topic, is Dr. Jeff Sugar, who was up there. He happened to be there when I presented the one that flopped, yes. And it was a measurement session. And later when I asked him to be an expert for it, because I knew he had seen it, you know, what I was doing, he's out in California and he is a top psychiatrist out there. Finally, he would not answer my emails, and I decided to pick up the telephone at what would be 8 or 9 a.m. California time. He answered, and I said, hey, Jeff, it's Jane Weatherhead. You know, did you get the email? You know, Jane, I wouldn't have answered the phone if I didn't think this was important. And that's when it told me to keep going, even though I had really a hard time getting answers from the experts for like a year. I thought, well, Jeff says he'll help me finally after 6 months. Maybe I'll keep going.
You know, I had a question about, like, so you're saying that the original measure was from
Dr. Collins.
in South Africa?
He's a South African
Okay,
professor.
so has anyone ever, like, said, like, oh, this is, you know, you use people from South Carolina, and are there cross-cultural?
It's just cultural. In other words, as long as you test it in the United States, it's a cultural thing. That's why when I found it, and then I realized that other papers had tested it in South Korea, he'd done it with other people. South Korea, South Africa, and Norway, for whatever reason, he did partner up with someone to test in the United States. It has since been tested in, I want to say Brazil, a South American country.
His one.
His one, yes.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker that gets real interesting. Dr. Reingold, remember the time I called her as a master's student and I was talking to her on the phone many, many years ago? I said, hey, I see this child sexual abuse myth scale you used in your research. How'd it pan out? She said, I couldn't get anywhere with it, Jane. And that was before I even walked into the mess and fixed it, kind of thing. And it wasn't that it was a mess. It was a good attempt in 1997.
Right.
It's just over time, measures need to be tweaked, just like the rape myth scale from 1980 had statements in it that then Lonsby and Fitzgerald came along and said, well, this needs to be revisited and tweaked a little bit.
I mean, do you think there would be cross-cultural differences?
Yes, there will. And here's a fascinating thing. Some Asian cultures just don't believe this exists. I spent some time sometimes talking to particular faculty about my topic and research, and they just said, Jane, you can't ask these questions on the survey.
Right.
Because in their culture, they could not accept that this would even be acceptable to ask a Canadian question. Yeah, so for example, I'm surprised that it did test out in some place like South Korea. I can tell you that right now. Just based on that and this topic.
It'd be difficult to act.
Well, certain
those
cultures.
kinds of questions.
Yeah, certain cultures just almost reject that it happens in their society. Yes, sure.
I promise, last question.
No, it's okay.
So the items are different, and what makes this process unique is that you have to treat items to be able to sensitive enough to capture the factors specific to the culture.
Yes.
That's the part. So were the factors similar across your and Dr. Collins? Not the items, but the factors that emerge.
Yeah, the factors. You're exactly right, like child blame for child. Okay. In his case, you have to remember there are two things here, Sri. He developed something called child sexual abuse myth scale is what he called it, right? He did have blame for parent, child, and I forget, I think one is society. I have the original paper, I can show you. The factors were similar. It was the statements that just really didn't test out statistically when I gave it to people. And it's kind of like when I demonstrated here, I just picked out a few of what I would deem the ickiest ones that people might not really agree with today anymore. And that's exactly on a common sense level kind of what happened. Yeah, and it is odd that a lot of them are similarly worded, but it tweaks out those nuances when someone reads one that they think, oh, I think there would be physical signs of some kind, but then might disagree that there would be proof. People do make those distinguishments when they're taking these things. That's a good thing to touch on, though. Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Yes. Is there like something where you think like, wow, this measure, if we could get it in this study to really test it, like so, like you've got to test the validity test, but then by testing in the wild, as it were, and throw it in the hopper and it sticks.
Yes.
What is there somewhere that you?
Yeah, so the way that this works, the scale development works, is first you got to publish the scales. You can't just throw them up there on ResearchGate. You put them through peer review. So right now, it's in the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse under review. It's out for review. Once it officially is published, because they'll maybe revise it a little bit, there's not a lot they can do, I think, with what the results are, but maybe the wording of the paper or some such thing. Once it's out there in the wild, as you might say, anybody can take it and use it and cite me, for sure. And in doing that, the more people that take it and use it and publish and take it and use it and publish, or even in the field take it and use it, it's going to get tested over and over and over again. And that's your desire, is to, so for the best way I describe this is there's a man named Rosenberg, and he developed the Rosenberg self-esteem scale in 1965. Now, this Rosenberg gentleman is dead. He is long dead. But we still will take his statements about levels of self-esteem and put them in a survey, and they still measure levels of self-esteem. He is still receiving citations after his death. He developed that measure again in 1965, and many scholars still use it as an accurate and valid measure of self-esteem in people. One thing I do want to talk about is the myth thing. Remember how Dr. Collins developed the child sexual abuse myth scale, and we have a rape myth scale? what happened during that first conference session when I had failed, blocked, and was kind of explaining this, people said, well, what really is a myth? What does myth mean? It just seemed to them myth. How can you get your head around the definition of a myth? And that's when it occurred to me that they were right, that that input was right. And remember the two constructs, aren't some of these statements really statements about blame for this? And aren't some of these statements really more stereotypes that really aren't true? And that's what caused me to not call it a child sexual abuse myth scale, like the rape myth scale. Because I realized, and that's also why I ended up with developing 2 scales for the price of 1, because that really was what would measure that construct and maybe tease that out a little bit more, try to break it out between plain and stereotypes. I don't know, I hope that made sense. Yeah, and again, I tried to stay away from too much about reporting the actual numbers, just which ones were important. But if anybody wants to see the stats in it, the course, eventually the paper, or I can send you the PowerPoint. And thank you, Shri. I want to thank Shri. Shri, that in the back of the room, helped me with this research when I hit a little bit of a brick wall at one point. I just showed him something, he gave me some feedback. It was very helpful.
Thank you all for attending. Our next talk is 3 o'clock at March 15th with Dr. Buck, titled Critical Letter Writing and Deliberation During the, help me,
The Brezhnev.
Brezhnev era. Yeah.
Thank you all, everybody. Have a good weekend.